The rancher's jaw kept growing, until the day it finally snapped. Elk Hollow, Montana. Nightfall. A scream, jagged and raw, tore through the Marlowe farmhouse. Grace bolted upright in bed, fumbling for the oil lamp. The glass chimney rattled in her shaking hands as the flame flared to life, casting a flickering glow over her husband. Clint Marlowe sat rigid on the mattress, eyes wide, breath caught mid-gasp. Half his face had gone slack, lips twisted and drooping as if gravity had taken hold of only one side. Blood glistened on his chin. "Clint," Grace whispered, his hands clutched at his jaw. The bones beneath his skin shifted, warped and swollen like driftwood torn by current. Then came the sound. A sickening internal crack, sharp as a branch snapping in a thunderstorm. Clint's jaw split down the middle. He collapsed forward, gasping through clenched teeth that no longer aligned. Grace screamed again, louder this time. As Clint writhed on the floor, a fresh rivulet of blood traced the line of his throat. She reached for him, but he began to convulse. His legs stiffened, his chest heaved once, then twice, and then silence. He wasn't breathing, not screaming, not crying, just going still. And in the awful quiet, Grace realized her husband was suffocating. From the inside out, 6 months earlier. Elk Hollow. Clint Marlowe woke before sunrise, as always. Not to an alarm or a rooster's crow, but to the natural rhythm of a life steeped in solitude. The horses needed tending, fences needed mending. And the hills, faint and blue in the morning light, always watched, like quiet judges. He washed his face with cold water from the basin, ran a hand over his stubbled jaw, and dressed without ceremony. Flannel, denim, leather. The same clothes, the same weight every day. The ranch had been in the Marlowe family for 3 generations. Clint had inherited it after both parents passed within 6 months of each other. His mother from pneumonia, his father from the grief that followed. Since then, Clint had poured every breath into rebuilding what time and hardship had taken. He wasn't a loud man, or a friendly one, but he was fair. The local livestock dealer in town once said, Clint Marlowe could go 10 days without speaking, and not one of them would feel wasted. Folks respected him for that. Some feared him, too, but not because he was cruel, because he was alone. And in places like Elk Hollow, people didn't trust what they didn't understand. His wife, Grace, had been the only exception. They'd met during the town's spring market, some 8 years back. She was a teacher's daughter from Missoula, visiting her aunt. He bought her an apple without speaking, and then handed her a folded note with 2 words, "Stay longer." They married that fall. It was a quiet ceremony by the river, just them and a minister from Great Falls. She never made him talk more than he could, but she always knew what he meant. Grace made the house into a home. She tended the herb garden, kept journals, read by the fire at night. She gave Clint what he never asked for, company that didn't feel like noise. Still, Clint remained a man of habit. He rose with the horses, worked with his hands, ate in silence, and prayed without speaking. Until the morning everything shifted. It was a warm spring day. He had just come back from the southern pasture, saddle creaking beneath him, dust in his beard. Grace met him at the fence, sun in her eyes. "You all right?" she asked. He looked at her, puzzled. "You're rubbing your face," she added. He hadn't noticed, but she was right. His fingers had been massaging his jaw. Not from pain exactly, just discomfort, pressure, something foreign. "Feels strange," he said. "Right here." He tapped his lower jaw. Grace frowned. "Toothache?" "No." Deeper. She put her hand on his cheek. "Maybe see a doctor?" Clint shook his head. "It'll pass." Didn't. Over the following weeks, the sensation grew. Not into pain, but into something more unnerving. A constant awareness of his jaw like a ticking behind the bones. He found himself clenching at night, grinding his teeth. His voice felt weighted, dull. Grace noticed the changes first, small things. He chewed more slowly, took fewer bites, drank more water. He stopped whistling to the horses. Stop talking altogether some days. Clint, she said one night, after he'd sat silent through supper, this isn't like you. He shrugged, but the truth sat heavy on his tongue. It's like it's not mine anymore, he murmured. My mouth, my face, like something's inside it, growing. Grace touched his hand. Then let's go to El Calo. You can see Doc Weller. I'm not sick. Maybe not, but something's wrong. He looked down at his plate. The stew had gone cold. I don't want the town talking. They see me coming in there with a complaint like this. They'll make a story out of it. Let them, she said. Let them talk. You're not made of stone, Clint. But already part of him was. By midsummer, the pressure in his jaw had turned into aching. Some days it radiated up into his ear, down into his neck. Chewing became a chore, speaking more rare. At night, Grace would find him staring into the coals, as if he were trying to burn something out from the inside. And always he denied the fear, until the day a lump appeared, just behind the hinge of his jaw. Small at first, hard, cold. He pressed it between his fingers, hoping it would vanish under pressure. Instead, it held. Grace tried to remain calm, but her eyes betrayed her. You're going to the doctor, she said. Clint didn't argue. That more than anything scared her. They rode to town the next morning. Doc Weller, a stout man with ink-stained cuffs and weary hands, examined Clint with increasing concern. Does it hurt when I press here? No, Clint said. But it moves. Weller nodded, frowning. You've got yourself a growth, Mr. Marlowe. Could be benign. Could be bone-related. I'd like to get someone with more experience to take a look. Someone from the university hospital. Clint's eyes narrowed. Out east. Probably. Might be something rare. Clint looked at Grace. She didn't speak, but her fingers closed over his. What do you think it is? He asked. Weller hesitated. Could be fibrous dysplasia. Or worse, could be cancer. The word sat between them like a hammer on a table. Grace flinched. Clint didn't. He stood, adjusted his coat. Send the telegram. Doc Weller looked up. You sure? Yes. When they left the office, Grace's steps were shaky. Clint walked steadily. I'm not afraid of dying, he told her, once they were out of earshot. But I want to know what I'm fighting. She nodded, voice too tight to reply. They returned to the ranch in silence. That night, Clint stood before the mirror and traced the shape of his own face. Already the lump had grown. Not much, but enough to change the angle of his jaw. Just slightly, just enough. In the dark, he whispered to the glass, as if daring it to speak back. Who are you becoming? By the time Frost first kissed the fence posts of Elk Hollow, the man known as Clint Marlowe was no longer seen riding into town. His absence was noted quietly, a missing face at the co-op, an empty space at the Sunday back pew. People asked about him without using his name. They said things like, is he still unwell? Or, I heard there's something strange happening up at the ranch. And always, the answer was vague. Grace is managing. Whispers had a way of slipping under doors and into corners. The most persistent rumor came from a trapper passing through from the north. He claimed he'd seen Clint at daybreak, standing in his field like a statue, mouth open, no sound coming out. And the light, he said, the light had caught his face in such a way that it looked like part of it had turned to stone. The story traveled fast. In the Elk Hollow saloon, men scoffed, but not loudly. The image lingered. It lingered especially for Dr. Roy Ellison, who heard it 2 towns over, whispered in jest between 2 cattle drivers. He didn't laugh. He just sipped his coffee, pulled a leather notebook from his coat, and wrote, Stone-jawed man, Elk Hollow, investigate. Ellison had been a battlefield surgeon during the war, the kind who saw men split open in ways textbooks never described. After the war, he became a wanderer. Not aimless, just untethered. He moved from town to town, helping where he could, recording strange cases in his journal, chasing the peculiar, the near impossible. He'd treated a man whose spine grew backward, a woman whose lungs filled with crystals, but never a man whose face, whose very identity, was being consumed by bone. He rode into Elk Hollow on a sleet-washed morning, dressed in a long black coat, saddlebags thick with medical texts. The townsfolk regarded him with guarded interest. Strangers meant questions, and in a town like this, questions carried weight. He went straight to Doc Weller's office. Weller, a thick-fingered man with kind eyes, met him with caution. "I know who you are," he said, offering no handshake. "You've stirred trouble in other places, poking at things best left alone." "I'm not here to stir anything," Ellison replied. "I heard about Marlowe. I came to help." Weller studied him, then exhaled and motioned him in. "I've done all I can," he admitted, pouring 2 cups of weak tea. "He's got a growth in his jaw, dense as hardwood. Started slow, but it hasn't stopped. His speech is almost gone. His breathing's strained. And he's wasting." Ellison leaned forward. "What kind of tissue?" Weller shook his head. "That's the strange part. It's not just soft mass. It's calcifying, turning to bone. But not like healing. It's a multiplying. Aggressively. I sent samples to a lab in Helena, but the response was inconclusive." Ellison nodded, his interest sharpening. "And his wife, Grace Marlowe, schoolteacher's daughter, been doing the nursing herself. Keeps notes. Keeps him grounded." Ellison sipped the tea. "I'd like to see him." "You'll need her blessing," Weller warned. "She's fierce about his privacy." They rode out together the next morning, through brown fields laced with frost. The ranch stood quiet, smoke curling from the chimney, horses grazing in the cold wind. The kind of place that should feel peaceful but didn't. Grace met them on the porch. She looked thinner than Ellison expected. Her eyes were sharp, sleepless, but her spine was straight. "I know why you've come," she said. "I'm not here for gossip," Ellison replied gently. "Just to help. And to learn." Grace didn't answer right away. Then she stepped aside. "He's in the parlor." The house smelled of cedar and iron. There were no curtains drawn, no dim light to hide behind. Just a man seated in a worn chair by the fire, his back straight, his hands still. Clint Marlowe's face was half shadow, half ruin. The left side remained, weathered, lined from sun and labor. But the right was barely human. His cheek and jaw jutted out in unnatural angles. Skin stretched over dense, misshapen bone. His lips no longer closed. The edge of his jaw had begun creeping into his neck. Breathing looked like work. Ellison knelt beside him. "I'm Roy Ellison," he said. "I've seen strange things. I'd like to help." Clint didn't speak. He reached slowly for a slate beside his chair and wrote with trembling hands. "Too late." Ellison shook his head. "It's not. Not yet." He examined the swelling, pressed lightly along the ridge of Clint's cheek, the angle of the jaw. It was like touching granite under skin. The mass was alive, not just present, but growing, reshaping the man from within. "Do you feel pain?" he asked. Clint erased the slate and wrote, "Not pain, pressure, like something else wants my face." Grace stood behind them, silent. Then she handed Ellison a leather-bound journal. "He wrote everything," she said, "until he couldn't." Inside were dated entries, precise, spare words, but heavy. "Feels like someone hammering from inside. Right eye twitching now. Can't sleep. Feels like it's spreading upward. Not pain. Not infection. This is construction." Ellison read in silence, every line like a piece of evidence in a trial only one man would survive. He closed the book and looked Clint in the eye. "You may have a rare tumor," he said carefully. "I suspect amyloblastoma. It originates in the jaw and grows bone of its own, not like yours, but similar enough." Clint raised a brow. "I don't think it's a curse," Ellison said, "but I do think it's killing you." Clint's jaw shifted, cracking faintly. Grace swallowed. Ellison stood. "There's a hospital in New York. A surgeon I trust. You'd need to travel, and quickly. I can write the letter myself. Arrange it." Grace stepped forward. "Would he survive?" Ellison looked from her to Clint. I don't know. But I know what happens if he stays. Clint closed his eyes, then picked up the slate. Go! They left 5 days later. Clint, Grace, and Ellison. The wagon was packed with blankets, salves, boiled water, and silence. Every jolt of the wheels brought pain. Clint no longer ate solids. He wrote less and less. One note, on the second day, read, "If I die, don't say it was a curse. Say I tried. Say I fought." On the third day, Clint's breathing collapsed. He woke gasping, clawing at his throat. The tumor had reached his windpipe. Ellison acted without hesitation. By the light of the wagon lantern, he boiled his instruments in river water. He carved a small incision in Clint's neck, a makeshift tracheotomy, and inserted a thin reed to allow him breath. Grace held Clint's hand through it all, never looked away. They reached a small town called Woodvale 2 nights later. A local doctor offered a room and temporary care. It was there that the telegram came. Patient too unstable. Surgery not advised. Recommend palliative care. Prepare family. Grace read the message aloud, then dropped it. Ellison said nothing. That night, he sat at Clint's bedside, watching the man sleep beneath a quilt stitched by Grace's mother. Another package arrived from New York. Lab results. Confirmed. Amyloblastoma. Aggressive. Spreading. No surgical path. Ellison sat for a long time. Then, with quiet conviction, he leaned down and whispered, "It's not your fault. It's not a punishment. It's not the devil or God. It's just a thing that happened. But you stood up to it. You didn't let it take you quietly. That matters." Clint stirred. His eyes opened. He looked at Grace. She leaned in, and in that silence, with nothing left to fight, Clint's hand found hers. They left Woodvale the next morning. Clint couldn't speak, could barely write, but the decision had been made. He would go. Grace wrapped him in every blanket they had, tucking hot stones by his feet, her hands trembling but steady. Ellison reinforced the wagon supports, packed extra bandages, disinfectants, reed tubes. He triple-checked the boiled water. He had seen men die from less, but something in Clint's eyes, what was left of them, refused stillness. As they pulled away from the clinic, the town doctor stood in the doorway, arms crossed. He didn't wave. He didn't need to. It was the kind of farewell that didn't pretend. They crossed eastward into frost and silence. The roads were frozen dirt veins, threading through pine forests and long empty valleys. Every bump jarred Clint's broken body. Every hour asked more of him. But he bore it, not with anger nor submission, but with a calm born from finality. He wasn't fighting to live anymore. He was fighting to go down facing forward. Grace sat beside him in the back, wiping his brow, holding his hand through coughing spells that now came with streaks of red. The tracheotomy allowed breath, thin, wheezing breath, but not speech. Clint scribbled only when he had to. The rest of the time, he simply watched the horizon. The days bled into each other. Wind bit deeper each night. Ellison drove the wagon without pause. He was a man possessed not by hope, but duty. He muttered to himself often, flipping through dog-eared pages in his journal during camp stops. One entry he had written the night they left Woodvale now stuck in his mind. He doesn't believe in miracles, but he believes in motion. That might be stronger. On the fourth night, they stopped near a river frozen solid in its bed. Grace read aloud to Clint from a book she'd kept since childhood. Poems her mother used to read in winter. His eyes fluttered, trying to stay open. "You still with me?" she asked, squeezing his hand. He tapped once against her palm. "Yes." She swallowed. "Good. Then I'll keep reading." On the fifth day, the rear wheel snapped. They'd been descending a narrow slope when the wooden rim cracked clean in two. The wagon buckled, nearly tipped. Grace was thrown sideways. Clint collapsed into the blankets, gasping. Ellison cursed. It took him 4 hours to carve a makeshift replacement from a downed birch. His hands bled from the cold. When they set off again, Clint had slipped into fever. He didn't wake for 2 days. Grace never left his side. She fed him broth by the spoonful, held compresses to his chest when the coughing rattled his ribs. Ellison slept barely an hour a night, constantly checking the tracheotomy. It had begun to swell. By the time they reached the outpost town of Bennett Ridge, the people who saw Clint carried into the local inn whispered that he looked more corpse than man. One child who saw him later said, "His face looked like two different people. One still fighting, the other already gone." They stayed 2 nights in Bennett Ridge. The local doctor offered no advice, only morphine. Grace refused it. Ellison argued, "It'll make him more comfortable. It'll make him quiet," she said. "He's still choosing. Until he can't, we don't take that from him." Clint woke at dawn the second morning. Grace was dozing against his arm. Ellison sat at the window reading. Clint motioned weakly toward his notebook. Grace handed it to him. His fingers trembled. But he wrote, "Is it still east?" She smiled. "It is." Clint nodded. They pressed on. Snow fell heavier now. The world shrank to white and wind. But the roads held. Towns came closer together the further east they traveled. More people, more noise. But Clint never reacted. He stayed wrapped in silence. His mind awake, but body ebbing. In Chicago, they took the train. Ellison had arranged it in advance, convincing a freight conductor with a quiet bribe and a solemn look. "The man's dying," the conductor said. "He'll never make it." "That's not the question," Ellison replied. "The question is if he wants to." They boarded in the dark, tucked in a back car surrounded by crates and feed sacks. The journey to New York took 2 days. Clint didn't move once. Grace fed him, cleaned the wound in his throat, whispered stories into his ear about the ranch, the horses, the way the earth smelled after rain. Ellison didn't speak much anymore. He had become a steward of breath. Each hour he checked Clint's chest, measured it, watched. When they stepped off in New York, it was snowing sideways. They took a rented cart to the hospital, a gray stone building with narrow windows and wide, quiet halls. The surgeons met them at the entrance, ushered Clint into a private room. Grace and Ellison were asked to wait. 2 hours later, the lead surgeon emerged. His face was composed, but not kind. "He's failing," the man said. "We can keep him warm, ease his passing. But surgery isn't an option." Ellison stepped forward. "We know." Grace only asked one question. "Can I stay with him?" "Yes," the surgeon replied. "We'll make arrangements." That night, Grace sat beside Clint's bed as snow fell outside the tall window. He was awake just barely, eyes half-lidded. She read him his own journal, entry by entry. From the first note about the strange sensation in his jaw, to the final line he'd written in Bennett Ridge. "I didn't lose if I made the choice." Clint's eyes shifted toward her. She leaned in. "You didn't lose." He blinked. She placed his hand over her heart. "You didn't lose, Clint." He closed his eyes, then opened them again, and for one last time, lifted the pencil. One last line. "I didn't let it make me cruel." Grace touched her forehead to his. "Never," she whispered. "You never did." On the 3rd day of their eastward journey, under a pale sky cracked with cold, Clint's breathing failed. It began quietly. Grace was holding his hand in the back of the wagon when she noticed his chest had fallen into a strange rhythm. Shallow draws that wheezed faintly through the reed at his throat. Then a sudden cough, short, wet, followed by silence. Clint's lips darkened. His eyes fluttered, then rolled back. "Roy!" Grace shouted. Dr. Ellison brought the wagon to a jarring halt, wheels digging into frozen earth. Grace had already pulled Clint upright, brushing snow dust from his face, fingers searching frantically for a pulse that seemed to slip beneath her skin. "He's choking," she said, voice shaking. The tracheotomy site had swollen. The air passage was narrowed. The reed, once steady, now fluttered loosely. Blood rimmed the wound. Ellison didn't hesitate. He threw open his medical bag, boiled what little water he had left over a campfire barely licking its own coals, and plunged his tools into it. Grace knelt beside Clint, whispering to him, one hand clutching his shoulder as if to tether him to the earth. "Clint, you stay. You don't leave like this. Ellison made a clean incision deeper, just below the collarbone. It bled fast, dark, too fast. He inserted a longer reed, steadied it with bandage, and tilted Clint's head slightly to one side. For a moment, there was nothing. Then came a sound, faint, hollow, the gasp of air rediscovering its path. Grace collapsed forward, forehead resting on Clint's shoulder. He didn't open his eyes, but he breathed, and that was enough. They reached Woodvale 2 nights later. It was a town of quiet habits and small kindnesses, nestled by a frozen river and protected by hills that curved like folded arms. Ellison carried Clint into the local clinic himself. The man had lost all strength in his limbs, and his weight, once that of a rancher, had dwindled to almost nothing. Dr. Franklin Dorsey, the town physician, took one look at Clint and cleared a room on the spot. "No promises," he said, "but he can rest here, warm, quiet." The next days blurred. Ellison and Dorsey worked in shifts, managing the airway, draining fluid, injecting mild sedatives when the spasms became too much. Grace never left Clint's side. She read from his journal. She recounted stories from their ranch. How one of the Maras once refused to drink unless Clint whistled. How the neighbor's boy tried to steal peaches and Clint chased him off with a slingshot and a grin. Clint listened. He could no longer smile, not with the disfigurement. But his fingers, though weak, still moved across Grace's hand in slow taps. Still here. The tumor was now visible from across the room. It had overtaken the entire right side of his face and begun to press into his throat and down toward his chest. The skin above it stretched, raw and shiny. A dark vein pulsed through it, rising like a twisted root. His breath was constant effort. Still, he endured. The telegram arrived on the 5th night. Grace opened it outside, away from Clint's room. The paper was cold in her hands. The ink smudged. Patient not viable for surgery. Advanced amyloblastoma. Risk exceeds survivable margins. Recommend palliative care. Prepare family. She read it 3 times, then folded it slowly and slipped it into her coat. When she returned to Clint's room, she sat beside him as though nothing had changed. He opened his eyes, tapped her palm. She smiled. "Still here," she whispered. "I know." That same night, Ellison received a package from New York, thick, clinical, heavy with finality. Inside were full lab results, radiographs, histology diagrams. He studied them under lamplight, flipping pages with the intensity of a man refusing despair. Dorsey joined him, peering over his shoulder. "You're seeing it, aren't you?" Ellison said quietly. "The shape of it." Dorsey nodded. "It's not just growing. It's imitating." The amyloblastoma wasn't spreading like rot or infection. It was building, as if it had memorized the shape of Clint's jaw and set out to replicate it. A second skeleton hidden beneath the skin, but denser, hungrier. "It doesn't know how to stop," Ellison murmured. "It thinks its job is to complete a version of him. Only there's no room left." He stood and walked to Clint's bedside. The man was asleep, breath rattling through the reed like wind through reeds on a winter marsh. "You're fighting your own echo," Ellison whispered. "And still you're here." In the morning, a nurse handed Ellison another telegram. This one was personal. From the lead surgeon at the New York hospital. Case reviewed in full. Advanced amyloblastoma. Surgical removal impossible without complete craniofacial dissection. Terminal. Recommend closure. Note. Patient's endurance extraordinary. Please submit case to journal. Ellison read it, then quietly tore it in half. He would not reduce Clint to a footnote in someone's archive. That night, as the wind pressed hard against the shutters and the lamplight grew long, Ellison sat beside Clint, alone. He leaned forward, close to the man who had traveled hundreds of miles not to be saved, but to bear witness to his own truth. "It's not your fault," he said. "It was never your fault. This wasn't judgment or punishment. It was a thing that happened." He paused. "But what you chose, that was yours. You didn't stay in bed. You didn't curse anyone. You looked it in the face. And you kept going. Clint's fingers moved slowly. Ellison watched. Grace entered a moment later. He took her hand. His breath had grown shallow, but his eyes were still clear. She brought his notebook. He held the pencil. It took several minutes to shape a line. When he handed the page back, it read, "If I had been cruel, it would have won. But I wasn't." The next morning, just after midnight, Clint stirred once. His breath caught, then exhaled. Grace, already holding his hand, felt it. She placed her head gently on his chest. No fear, no rattle, only silence. He was gone. It was just past midnight when Clint Marlowe died. There was no final gasp, no trembling of limbs, only a long, steady exhale that seemed to release not just breath, but burden. Grace was beside him, his hand in hers. She didn't cry, not yet. She pressed her forehead to his shoulder and listened to the stillness, willing it to be peace, not absence. Dr. Ellison stood in the doorway. He had been awake for hours, reading through Clint's journal again by lamplight, studying the final entries like scripture. When he heard the silence stretch too long, he walked quietly to the bedside. Grace met his gaze and nodded. He stepped forward, felt for a pulse that wasn't there, and whispered, "He's gone." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure gone was the word. The room remained unchanged, warm, dim, filled with the scent of cedar and salve. Clint's body lay wrapped in wool, one hand resting on his chest, the other still curled loosely around Grace's fingers. There was no panic, no cries, just presence. Ellison sat down beside him. He reached into his coat and pulled out the package from New York, the one he hadn't opened in front of Clint. Inside was the full diagnosis, confirmed by 3 specialists. Diagrams showed the interior structure of Clint's jaw and neck, the tumor building itself like scaffolding beneath the skin, laying bone over bone, curling into places no knife could reach. It was, they said, a rare and exceptional case, a marvel of biological defiance. But Ellison saw something else. Not science. A man. That morning, before the sun rose, Ellison stepped outside and sent a final telegram back east. Patient passed in peace. Case concluded. Will forward documentation. Note: this was not a story of failure. It was a story of courage. When he returned, Grace was folding Clint's final possessions. The coat he wore from Elk Hollow, the journal, a pocketknife dulled from years of fence cutting. On the last page of the journal, beneath his final message, "I didn't let it make me cruel." She placed a dried lilac petal she had kept since their wedding day. Then she closed the cover and tied it with string. That evening, they laid Clint's body to rest in the small-town cemetery, beneath a bare tree that overlooked the river. Grace chose the spot herself. "He liked to see the water move," she said. A local preacher offered quiet words. There were no grand speeches, no thunderous sermons, just the sound of wind through branches and the soft clink of stone on earth. Dr. Ellison spoke once. He stepped forward, coat drawn tight, and said, "He didn't lose. Don't remember him as a man who lost. Remember him as one who stood in the path of something unrelenting and never stepped aside." Then he stepped back and let silence return. That night, back at the clinic, Ellison opened his leather journal and began to write. Case 147, Final Addendum. Clint Marlowe, aged 46, resident of Elk Hollow, Montana. Deceased from advanced amyloblastoma. No viable treatment. Patient chose to seek the truth of his condition, not out of desperation, but principle. His actions, enduring pain, choosing movement over retreat, reflect a depth of moral resilience rarely documented in medical literature. He died not in fear, but in clarity, and in love. His final words, written by his own hand, "I didn't let it make me cruel." That, in itself, is a victory. He closed the book. Then he sat for a long while in the lamplight, feeling the weight of stillness, not as loss, but as testimony. Clint Marlowe returned to Elk Hollow in a plain pine box. No ceremony, no inscription. Just the shape of a man who had walked into the heart of something unstoppable and never turned back. Grace and Dr. Ellison arrived with him, the wagon drawn slow through the valley, the winter winds settling as if to listen. The ridge where they buried him overlooked the ranch. Clint had often stood there, hat in hand, watching his horses run. The same ridge where, years earlier, he had promised Grace he'd build her a home. She had chosen that spot without hesitation. The townsfolk came quietly. They brought bread, blankets, tools to help with the grave. No speeches were given. But when Grace stepped forward, Clint's journal held tight to her chest. Everyone fell silent. She laid the journal atop the coffin. "I won't give in," she said, her voice calm. "Not as long as I can breathe." That's what he wrote. And he never did. Then she stepped back. They filled the grave together, earth by earth, boot by boot, until nothing was left but the wind, the grass, and the presence of a man who had not been defeated. Grace remained at the ranch. Winter passed like a long sigh through the valley. Snow drifted high along the fence lines, and the barn groaned under its own weight. Yet Grace stayed. She mended broken slats, hauled feed for the 2 remaining horses, kept the stove burning with logs Clint had chopped the summer before. The house, though quiet, did not feel empty. Clint's coat still hung on the wall. His journal rested on the mantel, bound in leather, its pages worn with fingerprints and ash. Some nights, Grace would open it with her tea and read until the lamp burned low. There was an entry she returned to most often. A short line, barely legible, scribbled the night before the second surgery attempt. "If I die, let them say it wasn't a curse. Let them say I walked forward." And she always said aloud, "You did." Dr. Ellison stayed for a short time after the burial. He helped Grace winterize the barn, repaired the stovepipe, and repaired the fence posts near the river. But come spring, he packed his things. A quiet man with a deeper stillness now. He left a bundle of firewood on the porch and handed Grace a letter. "This is for the journals," he said. She opened it only after he was gone. Inside was Clint's final diagnosis, written in clinical terms: advanced amyloblastoma. Terminal. Non-operative. But beneath the case report, Ellison had written a personal note. "Some men die trying to escape their fate." Clint met his, looked it in the eye, and said, "You don't get to decide who I am. I've seen men shot to pieces with more anger than pain. I've seen cowards live for decades without ever choosing to fight. Clint chose to move, knowing full well he couldn't win. That is not dying. That is victory." In the years that followed, people forgot the details. But they remembered the shape of the story. They remembered how Clint had vanished one autumn and returned the next as something else. Not a ghost, not a warning, but a kind of echo. A man who endured. A man who didn't surrender. Children in Elk Hollow would ride past the ridge and ask their parents, "Who's buried up there?" And they'd say, "Clint Marlowe, the man who didn't quit." Grace aged slowly. Her hair silvered, her steps slowed, but she remained on the land. She grew herbs in the spring, canned peaches in the fall. And every Sunday, she sat on the porch with Clint's journal, read one page aloud, then set it down with care. Ellison published Clint's case a year later. In a small medical journal out of St. Louis under the title Case Study 147, The Patient Who Endured. The article was precise, scientific. But the final paragraph read, "This was not the study of a tumor. It was the study of a soul. A man's identity was stolen piece by piece. His voice, his jaw, his very face. But he did not become bitter. He did not become afraid. He chose to move forward, not because it would save him, but because it was right. He is not remembered for what grew inside him, but for what grew around him. Dignity, love, and quiet defiance." That journal was quoted by 2 doctors in Boston, 3 in England, and even a military hospital in South Africa. A surgeon from Vienna wrote to Ellison months later, "Your patient taught my students something I could not. That suffering is not weakness, and death, when met with grace, is not failure." Ellison never replied. He carried Clint's final note in his coat pocket until the day he died. "I didn't let it make me cruel." Years after Clint's death, a local craftsman built a small fence around the grave. No one paid him, No one asked. He just did it. A wooden circle with smooth posts and rope, simple and strong. Someone carved a single word into one of the posts. Tried. No more was needed. The wind still passed over that ridge every season. The horses long gone. The ranch smaller now. But the air carried something different there. Not grief, but stillness. Not sadness, but memory. And on certain spring mornings, a single red flower bloomed by the grave. No one knew what kind. It never spread. Never died early. It just returned year after year as if to say, still here,